You know, I love the property market. I've encouraged people to buy property for ages, but at the moment there are some issues with it, and all the glitters is not gold. And we have to look at some of the key issues that are affecting particularly investors in Australia, but the general market, and that is stamp duty in Australia. Now, stamp duty is calculated as a percentage of the purchase price, and as the purchase price has risen, the stamp duty as a percentage also has risen to the point now where I think it's got to be ridiculous. Now, stamp duty in most states is between 4 and 6%. Now, that was usually 4 and 6% of 300,000 and then 500,000 and then 600. But in most of the big states, it's now $1 million, $1.5 million, $2, $3 million. So you're paying 6% on $3 million. That is $180,000 to buy a reasonable home in Sydney. That's the stamp duty cost. What is it for? To stamp a bit of paper to say this contract exists to move from you to someone else. That is an extortionate amount of money. And if the government was genuinely serious about helping people with affordable housing, look no further than stamp duty. You know, stamp duty at that percentage is off the charts. Now, the government could easily say, hey, let's just rewind it to a decent cost of, for argument's sake, maximum $30,000 per sale, or 50, or 100, or set it back to a price, you know, that was before. Cap it, do something, but don't leave it as an open-ended revenue stream, especially when it's going to nowhere and just general revenue to be wasted. If you have a look at what goes on, is not only do you have stamp duty, but when you buy a newly constructed home or an apartment, there is GST in that price. Now, who gets the GST? The state government, who charges you the stamp duty. So to me, this is a double dip. They should stop doing this, because if they're serious about, you know, fixing the market, the number one issue is supply. GST should not be on properties, full stop. 10% is the rate. That is a huge amount to put on $1 million, $1.5 million, $2 million thing. It's designed to be on something cheap, $100, $200, $500 service, not hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now again, why should they double dip? If they're dinkum, remove GST from new construction to encourage more property into the market to fix the supply shortage and balance the market quicker than otherwise. And they need to do that because construction costs has gone up, so we need to get some relief into the construction industry so that they start building more. Right now across Australia, the construction costs have risen so much that many projects that were meant to be starting have not commenced and are not likely to commence, if ever, or for many years. That has to be fixed, and the GST removal is the quickest and easiest way. And then what I call the triple dip is if a foreigner buys that property, then they also get charged, you know, additional stamp duty as a foreigner of 7 to 8%, depending on the state. And if you have a look at that over the period, it's now becoming very prohibitive for a foreigner to invest. Now, way back in December 15, we suggested to the government, and they took up the fact that we said, hey, foreigners wouldn't mind paying a fee, and they introduced what we thought was reasonable at $5,000 if you bought as a foreigner a property in Australia. Now, for those that don't know, a foreigner can only buy a brand new property. That's the law. If you do not have permanent residency, if you do not have citizenship, you cannot buy a second-hand established property. The only exception is if you are in Australia under a temporary visa and you can buy something to live in the established market. But as soon as your visa expires, which is usually students that finish their course, you must sell that home unless you move to a permanent visa. Now, they brought that fee in, but even that has lifted from what was $5,000 to $6,000, and then it was doubled in July 22 and increased again this year to over $14,000. And that's per $1 million. So it's $14,000 anything under $1 million, and then another $14,000 for every $1 million thereafter. So if you buy a big one, it's a fortune. On top of that, the state government started introducing additional stamp duty, 3% originally in Victoria in July 15, and then they increased it to 7%, 8% across the board, and now it's in everywhere except ACT. What you've got here is we went to the government and said, hey, don't do this. You cannot keep charging these foreigners. These were an important part of supply into the rental market. And you can see, up until 2015-16, we had jumped up to 40,000 plus sales to foreigners each year, which was supplying enormous amount of rental, enormous amount of property, enormous amount of construction, employment, growth, activity. But what happened was it dropped off the cliff. I don't think because it was delayed. I think no one knew about it until they started to finish the buildings. And once that word got out, it went back down. Now, we've usually had about 5,000 foreign sales a year. And you see we're now back at or below that level, which is quite tragic to have gone back into reverse at a time when we need as many properties in the market as humanly possible to cope with the vacancy, to cope with the supply shortage, etc. The government should be starting to incentivise foreign buyers like they are currently doing in WA, where they're giving concessions of up to half of your foreign buyer surcharge and stamp duty. But that's the only state doing it at the moment. But this is a disgrace in my mind. If you have a look at what's going on, is on top of these high charges, we're also seeing each state government introduce surcharges for land tax. And land tax is the sleeping monster, because most Australians don't know about it because they don't pay it if they live in their house. But it's becoming ridiculously expensive if you live overseas. And the values have been sneaking up surreptitiously in the background. So if you ever lived in a house and then chose to rent it out, it would club you once you find out how much your land tax is actually going to be. And this is very, very concerning. And again, incredible sums of money for very little effort, for very little expenditure. It's just revenue for the governments and no one's keeping it in check. We also have a vacancy tax, federally and also in Victoria. And Victoria has become the unfriendly state for property investors, introducing a COVID tax, allegedly temporarily, which is there for 10 years. I'm not sure if my dictionary defines temporary as 10, but they're going to charge about $1,000 a year to every landlord, making them solely responsible for putting back in the coffers the cost of being in COVID when it was the government's choices to do. And then we've also got, coming up soon in Victoria, a short-term tax of 7.5%. Now, the government is saying that that's not a tax on the landlord because they're going to push it onto the occupant, the person that's renting your house. They're going to charge them 7.5%. Excuse me. But it's about the fact that someone has to pay it. It's going to come out of somewhere, and it's just a cash grab for no real benefit. It's a terrible thing.